I will say buenos días, and es lo último que se dirá en español. And buenas tardes para Mark y para otros colegas que están en otro horario. So good morning, everybody, and good evening for Mark and other European and, well, South African colleagues. Well, today we have Professor Mark Solms and we have Dr. Daniela Flores Mosri. And as we have announced today, we shall conduct our session only in English. So I shall introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. I am Olga Santa Maria, president of the Mexican Psychoanalytic Association, APM. And with me here today is our board. We have Julio Casillas, our secretary. We have Rosa Corso, our treasurer. Our scientific committee, Liliana Hernandez and Judith Harders, and our media committee, Brígido Navarrete. All of us are very, very honored to have with us today in this scientific section, Professor Mark Solms, who some of us have had the privilege of meeting in person on other occasions. I was remembering, I met Daniela and Mark on the same day, some time ago in Mexico City in a restaurant, maybe you remember.
I remember the tequilas.
You remember the tequilas and the pyramids, I guess. Great. And Dr. Daniela Flores will be coordinating this session today. And may I say that when the time comes for Q&As, you may write in the chat either in Spanish or in English, as you prefer. And I shall give you a brief introduction of Professor Mark Solms and of Daniela. Some of our guests today are new in this, and I think it is very important that you know each of them. So Professor Mark Solms was born in 1961. He was educated at Pretoria's Boys' School at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He emigrated to England in 1988. There, he worked at the University College of London at the Department of Psychology and the Royal London Hospital at the Department of Neurosurgery, while he trained at the Institute of Psychoanalysis. He returned to South Africa in 2002 and now holds the chair of neuropsychology at the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Cape Town and Groote Schuur Hospital. His rating by the National Research Foundation is A1, and he is a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He has received numerous prizes and honors, such as the Sigourney Prize, the IPA's Outstanding Scientific Achievement Award, and honorary fellowship of the American College of Psychiatrists. He is training director of the South African Psychoanalytic Association, director of the Science Department of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and research chair of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He has published 350 articles in both neuroscientific and psychoanalytic journals, and he has authored 8 books. The Brain and the Inner World was translated into 13 languages. His collected papers were published recently as The Feeling Brain, and his latest book, The Hidden Spring, appeared in early 2021. He is the editor and translator of the forthcoming revised standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud, 24 volumes, and complete neuroscientific works of Sigmund Freud, 4 volumes. So that is just about it for Mark Solms. Now I shall introduce you to Daniela Flores Mosri. She is a PhD psychologist, and she started her research career investigating sleep disorders at the Reticular Formation Lab run by neurophysiologist Raúl Alvarado Calvillo at the National Institute of Neurology and Neurosurgery. This epidemiological research was awarded second place by the National Council of Psychology in 2000. Dr. Flores mostly trained as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and her interest in the dialogue between psychoanalysis and neurosciences began in 1999. With the help of Dr. Alvarado, Daniela started studying potential methods to do research in neuropsychoanalysis. She then began her doctoral studies, focusing on addiction and examining the spontaneous neurochemical manipulations by users of psychotoxic drugs as a method of investigating the correlates of neurochemical modifications in affect and psychodynamic features. She has studied borderline pathology from a mainly affective perspective and is currently conducting research on latent depression. Daniela is a full-time lecturer and researcher at the Universidad Intercontinental and has also taught courses of neuropsychoanalysis at the Mexican Psychoanalytic Association and at the Mexican Association of Group Analytic Psychotherapy called AMPAG. Her clinical practice focuses on borderline states, addiction, depression, psychosomatic illness, and sleep and eating disorders, amongst others. Since 2014, Daniela has been a liaison officer in Latin America for the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society, and she has recently accepted the invitation to be the managing editor of the Journal of Neuropsychoanalysis. Congratulations. Okay, so at this point, Daniela, you have the word and you shall conduct this meeting with Mark, if we may call you Mark, and if we may call you Daniela, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Olga, and thank you. I mean, I'm getting messages from people like, thank you for being so generous and just offering this session for free registration. People really appreciate it. So thank you very much. And well, the way we're going to work, we're going to have Mark's talk. I told him, like, if he wants to speak for over an hour, we will be very pleased, because that's exactly what we've been waiting to hear. And he's going to be speaking about consciousness. We hope to hear a lot about your new book. I'm particularly interested in the second half of the book, but I mean, just the way you planned your talk. And then after he finishes his talk, then I'm going to give some brief comments, and then we're going to open discussion to the floor. So then we're going to request that you try not to use the chat window at the moment, so that you don't get distraction with all the, you know, the popping signs there, like someone's writing. So try to write down your questions separately, and then when we, yeah, exactly. And then when we're ready, just write them down on the chat window, and then we'll select a few of those so that you can ask Mark directly if we have enough time, or we're going to read some of your questions. It depends on the time, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so then Mark, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Olga. I'm very pleased that under your leadership, your society is taking such a keen interest in scientific matters. It doesn't apply in every psychoanalytic society. I think it's the first time I've heard Daniela's CV so comprehensively. I didn't realize, Daniela, that you started in a reticular activating system lab, because, as you know, that's very relevant for what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm so sorry I can't be in Mexico City. It's one of my favorite, I think it's one of my very favorite cities in the world. And I wish I could be there. But of course, the advantage of not being there is that we can have this meeting where there are many people who are not in Mexico who also are able to join us this evening. I've decided two things. The first is that I'm going to try to leave as much time for discussion as possible. I tend to be long-winded and I talk too much. I'm going to try to curtail that. Daniela said that I may speak for more than an hour, but I see we're already, more than 10 minutes into our 2 hours. So I'm going to try to say the main things I want to say, and rather than oversay them, leave enough time for anything that's not clear for us to discuss it. So I feel as if I'm among friends and we're going to have a discussion. On that score, I must also say I'm not going to give you a formal lecture and show you slides and bamboozle you. I want to just talk to you. I think that psychoanalysts are more comfortable with people who just talk rather than show slides. And I am addressing myself mainly to the psychoanalytic members of our audience, because this is an invitation from a psychoanalytic society. So that said, my book, which is going to be the main focus of what I'm talking about, because my book is about consciousness, and our topic consciousness is at the forefront of my work at the moment because I've just written this book with the title The Hidden Spring. This book is not written for psychoanalysts. It's not aimed at psychoanalysts. It's aimed at a general scientific readership. And it's mainly written in the language of neuroscience and also in the language of information science, statistical physics. So that makes it inaccessible, I think, and perhaps less interesting than it might be to psychoanalysts, which is a pity, because it actually is deeply imbued with psychoanalytic ideas. I am very much a psychoanalyst. So I want to use this time that of this meeting to try to convey some of the main ideas in my book and some of my main ideas about consciousness to a psychoanalytic audience. So it will be a sort of a translation and an emphasizing of those points that are of interest to psychoanalysts and a de-emphasizing of some of them which are perhaps less interesting to psychoanalysts. I'm going to make 10 points to you. I've written them down here. I've got a piece of paper with 10 points on them, and I'm going to run through those 10 points, hopefully leaving plenty of time for discussion. So here they come. I'll number them so that you know you can count down when we're getting to the end. Number one, I said that this book, although it's not addressed primarily at a psychoanalytic audience, that it's deeply imbued with psychoanalytic ideas. So I want to tell you, as my first point, what the fundamental psychoanalytic ideas are that underpin this book. They are the following. Firstly, this will be no surprise to you. The first psychoanalytic idea is that most cognition is unconscious. Most of our cognitive processes go on unconsciously. Now, this was once a radical, uniquely psychoanalytic idea. That is no longer the case. It is now a mainstream idea in cognitive neuroscience, but it is one of my two main starting points. And it has big implications, as you'll see, for my argument. Nowadays, not only is it a mainstream idea in cognitive neuroscience, I think even Freud would be surprised by how much, when I say most cognitive processes are unconscious, I mean most. There's just a teeny weeny little bit of cognition that's conscious by comparison with how much goes on unconsciously. The second idea, which underpins the whole argument of this book, is that by contrast, by sharp contrast with cognition, which mainly proceeds unconsciously, affects are intrinsically conscious things. This was a Freudian idea. Freud's idea was that by contrast with cognition, what he termed representational processes, by contrast with cognitive representational processes, affective feeling processes derived from the life of the drives are conscious. Now, I'm aware that many psychoanalysts don't agree with this point, but it's a Freudian idea. Freud was adamant from the first to the last of his theoretical writings on affect, that affects are intrinsically conscious things. It is for Freud, and he said as much, an oxymoron. In other words, a linguistic impossibility to say that you can have a feeling that you don't feel. The very meaning of the word feeling is that you feel it. So that turns out to have big implications for our understanding of consciousness, and I will try to explain those implications as I go along. However, because I'm aware that many psychoanalysts don't agree with Freud, they believe there are such things as unconscious affects. Let me just say now, and I will say more later, let me just say now, of course, I, as a psychoanalyst, know as well as you do that you can defend yourself against your affects, that there are defenses that are directed against affects, and then they are prevented from happening. But for Freud, the crucial thing is that cognitions are structures which have a relatively permanent existence. Feelings for Freud are events. In fact, in his way of thinking, they are discharge processes. And if you prevent those events from happening, then you've prevented yourself from feeling a feeling. And everything hangs on that. If you don't feel something, it makes a big difference compared to if you do feel something. These two ideas of Freud, the distinction between the quantitative quota of affect, as he called it in his 1895 paper, The Neuropsychosis of Defense, when he first introduced this idea. This distinction between the quota of affect, which is conscious, and the memory traces of ideas, the representational fabric of cognition, which is unconscious in itself. That distinction, James Strachey, who translated that paper in the standard edition of Freud's writings, the English complete edition of Freud's writings, he appends an editor's appendix to that paper, does James Strachey, where he says, this is the emergence of Freud's most fundamental ideas. So that distinction that I've just drawn between the mostly unconscious nature of cognition and the inherently conscious nature of feelings is not just an idea of Freud's, it's one of his most basic ideas, at least according to James Strachey, and I agree with Strachey in that respect. So that's my point one. I remember I'm going to say more about how affects become unconscious later. But for now, I'm starting with this very basic thing that a feeling has to be felt. Otherwise, it's not a feeling. Okay. A thought can be thought without you being conscious of it. But a feeling can't be felt without you being conscious of it. That's all I'm saying. My whole book pivots on that very simple idea. And remember, it comes from Freud. I'm very grateful to Freud. And as I think the whole of contemporary neuroscience should be, as you'll see as I go along. Now, my second point out of the 10 that I'm going to make to you. My second point is that what affects are is the subjective manifestation of drives. This again is a Freudian idea, basic Freudian idea. For Freud, a drive is a measure, I'm quoting Freud here in English, a drive is a measure of the demand made upon the mind to perform work by virtue of the connection between the mind and the body. So if a drive is being satisfied, you feel it as pleasure. If a drive is being frustrated, you feel it as unpleasure. Affect is the subjective manifestation of drive. And I want to emphasize again that it makes a very big difference whether that subjective manifestation is felt or not. In fact, the fact that drives are felt is so fundamental to my argument. I want to, at this point, make this general remark. The hard problem of consciousness, as it's called, which is generally considered to be the biggest problem in neuroscience today, if not the biggest problem in all of science today. The hard problem of consciousness pivots on exactly this question of why do we have to become aware of any of our bodily processes at all? Why is there anything that's conscious? If we are a machine, a biological machine that functions according to causal mechanistic laws, then why do we have to be aware? Why do we have to feel the functioning of this machinery? Why doesn't it just behave like a zombie? Why aren't we just like robots? Why do we have to be conscious at all? And as I'm going to spell out for you, this idea that feelings are the subjective manifestation of drive means that it is the way in which the machine becomes aware of its own states, how well it is doing in terms of satisfying its biological needs. So this question as to why are we conscious at all has everything to do with the fact that that consciousness in the form of affects is how we become aware of how we're doing in terms of drive regulation. I know that the concept of drive is no longer that fashionable in psychoanalysis, but it was absolutely fundamental to Freud's way of thinking. And so again, you see that this Freudian idea that affects, we become aware of how we, of anything at all, because we need to know how we're doing in terms of the regulation of our drives, which basically boils down to whether we're meeting our needs or not. Now, I want to make clear what I mean by a drive, because I think that this concept is shrouded in obscurity. There is a difference between a need and a drive. We biological systems, we creatures, we all have needs. We have multiple needs, and those needs are pressing for satisfaction all the time, and they're not the same thing as drives. I'll give you an example. We are constantly burning up the sugar supplies in our fatty tissues in order to provide our bodies with the energy that they need. This is not a drive, it's just happening autonomically. It happens automatically all the time. The same applies to respiration. It's autonomic. You need oxygen, but it's not a drive. It's just happening. The same with blood pressure regulation. It's just happening. These all have to do with basic bodily needs, but we don't feel them, and it's in that sense that they're not drives. They just happen automatically. Think about what I just said about burning up of our glucose supplies, which is how we obtain the energy that we need. When you become hungry, this is a very different thing. Now you are driven. This is a demand upon the mind to perform work. Remember Freud's definition of drive. It's not that it's a need, not a bodily need. It's a demand made by the body upon the mind to perform work. And the feeling of hunger is the drive. The feeling of thirst is the drive. The feeling of sleepiness is the drive. The feeling of the need to urinate is the drive. Your bladder is distending all the time, but it only becomes a drive when you feel, I want to void my bladder. I need to void my bladder. That's what we mean by drive. It's a demand. I said about respiratory control, that our need for oxygen is managed automatically. But when you find yourself suffocating, when you find yourself in a smoke-filled room, suddenly it becomes a drive, and then it governs your behavior in a very different way from this kind of autonomic regulation going on in the background. So I'll come back to that as we go along. The basic Freudian idea that feelings are how we become aware of how we're doing in terms of meeting our drive needs. That feelings, pleasurable feelings, mean that the drive demand is being reduced, and unpleasurable feelings mean that the drive demand is being increased. Freud's idea was this is the fundamental form of consciousness. This is where consciousness comes from. Consciousness is fundamentally affective, and the reason that we have affects is so that we can know how we're doing in terms of satisfying, meeting our organismic needs. Freud said this in the interpretation of dreams in 1900, and he said it again even more clearly in formulations on the 2 principles of mental functioning in 1911, that the fundamental form of consciousness is feeling, is affect. It was only in 1924, in a paper called the Metapsychological Supplement to the Theory of Dreams, that Freud joined the consciousness, that is the awareness of the state of our own drive demands, which he called the system consciousness, that he attached that to the system perception, which looks outwards. And then Freud spoke of a system perception consciousness. He joined the two. The system perception and the system consciousness became one unified system. And that was an unfortunate step, in my view, on Freud's part. And I'll explain why now. And that's my third point that I'm leading up to. The third point is the following: that perception, like all cognition, is not an intrinsically conscious process. There's no special relationship between perception of the outside world and consciousness. Perception is just another one of those representational cognitive processes which are not inherently conscious. They have no special relationship to consciousness, unlike affect, which, as I keep saying, is the fundamental form of consciousness and which is an intrinsically felt thing. The whole point of affect is so that you can feel it. And even though I know we can defend ourselves against it, nevertheless, the whole functional purpose of affect is to feel it. It does its work by us becoming aware of it. This is the demand that it makes upon us to do something in the outside world to satisfy our biological needs. Now, I say that perception is not intrinsically conscious. This is very easy to demonstrate. And it's in fact not a controversial idea. All of this, as I said, this idea that cognition is fundamentally unconscious is not controversial anymore. It's not uniquely psychoanalytic anymore. I'll tell you just one experiment. We have an instrument, we've had it for a long time, called the tachistoscope, which enables you to flash visual images at a research subject so briefly, for so few milliseconds, that they don't realize they've seen anything at all. If you flash, for example, a face with a word underneath it, let's call it face A, and the word underneath that face says rapist. The person doesn't know they've seen anything, but you have in fact flashed for a few milliseconds a face A, underneath it says rapist. Then you flash another face B, for a few milliseconds, and underneath that face it says philanthropist. Then after you've done that with the tachistoscope, you say to the research subject, did you see what I just showed you? They say, no, you showed me nothing. Then you say, okay, now I'm going to show you two faces, and you show them face A and you show them face B, and you say, which one do you prefer? They say, I have no preference. I've never seen these faces before. So you say to the research subject, but just guess. You give them a forced choice. They have to decide which one they prefer. The very large majority of research subjects say face B, the one that said philanthropist underneath it. So there we can show that perception has occurred unconsciously. And I don't just mean perception of some little blurry something. It's perception of a particular face with a particular word that they can read and understand and associate with that face. All of this can go on unconsciously. So what's important about that is that those are uniquely human higher cortical functions like face recognition and name, reading with comprehension and so on. All of this can go on unconsciously. And it leads to the question, well, why then do we have consciousness at all? Because as I've just showed you, you can do all of that without being conscious. So why do we have to be conscious? And this is the hard problem of consciousness, that clearly the mechanism whereby vision comes about and face recognition and reading and learning and so on, the mechanism whereby all of this comes about can be entirely explained without you having to explain why it feels like something. And in fact, the mechanism can work perfectly well without you feeling anything. So what is the consciousness for? And this has led to this great mystery and to many people saying, well, consciousness is not something real. It doesn't actually do anything and so on. So I want you to notice that when the research subjects make a choice between the two faces, they prefer face B. They have a gut feeling that face B is nicer. They don't know where that gut feeling comes from, but they do have a preference, and that preference is affective. And so there again, we see that what is unconscious is the cognition, but what is conscious is the gut feeling, I prefer face B. And crucially, the research subject doesn't know why they prefer face B. Now, I'm making 2 points simultaneously here. The one is, please note that it is conscious, the feeling. This is the whole point that this book pivots on. But please note also, it's not only pivotally important for the hard problem of consciousness, because actually it's not the whole mechanical process did not proceed without consciousness. It proceeded without cognitive consciousness, but there was an affective consciousness. And so this is where we should be looking if we're wanting to understand what consciousness is for. It's got something to do with feelings. But I also want you, my dear psychoanalytic colleagues, to notice that this is the fundamental issue in our clinical work. Our patients feel things. They just don't know why they feel them. They don't know where they come from. So this basic, simple issue, which proves to be so important for solving the hard problem of consciousness, is also really a fundamental issue for everything that we do in psychoanalysis. The difference between feeling things and knowing why we feel those things is at the heart of our clinical work. Okay, so I've made 3 points. Now I must come to my 4th point. And this is in order to start unpacking the implications of all of this for the hard problem of consciousness. The whole of cognitive neuroscience, in trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness, has been looking to the cortex as the organ of consciousness. And in particular, it's been looking to visual cortex and visual perception in order to understand how consciousness comes about. It has been our sort of unquestioned assumption of cognitive neuroscience that consciousness is a cortical function, that it's bound up with this sort of stuff that we're experiencing now. Things like vision dominate our consciousness. And so this seems like a reasonable place to start in terms of trying to understand consciousness. That is despite the facts that I've just summarized for you, namely that, in fact, the cortex does its job perfectly well without being conscious, that perceptual processes like visual perceptual processes clearly are not intrinsically conscious processes because they can work just as well without consciousness. So to me, it's no surprise that we've made so little progress, because if we've been using visual cortical perceptual processes as our model example of consciousness, then we've been using something which is not intrinsically conscious as our model example of consciousness. And so, of course, we've gotten nowhere. So where should we be looking? We should rather be looking at where the feelings come from. And the feelings, it turns out, are not conscious process, not cortical processes at all. How do we know that feelings are not cortical processes? Well, there's lots of evidence for that. So remember, cognition is a cortical process. It's a forebrain process. A feeling, which is intrinsically conscious, is in fact a function of the brain stem, a much more ancient and much more primitive part of the brain than the cortex, which we're so proud of as human beings. The brain stem is an ancient structure which is more than 500 million years old, because we share it with all vertebrates. How do we know that this is in fact where feeling comes from? Well, the most dramatic evidence for it is, and I'm now on my point 4, is that there are children who are born without a cortex. The condition is called hydranencephaly. Instead of cortex, they just have cerebrospinal fluid. These children are conscious. That's the great shock. According to the idea that consciousness is a cortical function, these children should be in a coma, but they're not. They're conscious. They're conscious not only in the sense that they wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night, which they do, and then conscious not only in the sense that they can lose consciousness when they have seizures, which they do, but they're also conscious in the sense that they show feelings. They get irritable if they don't get what they want. They get delighted if things happen that they like. They get a surprise and a shock, and they cry if you frighten them, etc. So they show feelings. They show a wide range of basic feelings, and they show them in a situationally appropriate way. In other words, they are responding with the appropriate affect to the appropriate situations. And they even show initiative in relation to feelings. In other words, they strive for things that they like, and they avoid things that they don't like. So that, as I say, is the most dramatic evidence for the fact that the cortex is not where feelings come from, because you have feelings even if you have no cortex. Now, I know some of you, like many scientists, will say, well, how do we know that those children are really feeling anything? They look as if they're feeling something, but they can't tell us what they're feeling because they don't have any cortex. Language, a cognitive function, is a cortical function. So these children can never speak. There's no possibility of them being able to tell us what their experience is like. So in science, we don't use only one method. And if I may digress for a moment, this is very important for us in psychoanalysis to remember. It's bad to use only one method. I hear it said often in psychoanalytic circles, our method is the psychoanalytic method. We don't look at all these other methods. Well, that's bad science, because each method has its strengths and its weaknesses. There are enormous strengths in the psychoanalytic method, but there are weaknesses too. And the same applies to the method I've just described to you, which is called the Lesion Method. In other words, damage to brain structures, observing what is lost and what is not lost with damage to a particular part of the brain is one method. But it's not the only method. So we use other methods too to probe the same scientific question. So I've told you that a child with only a brain stem shows feelings. But we don't know if they're really feeling them because they can't speak. So we use another method, which is that we take an electrode and we stimulate in the brainstem, and we have to do this in brain surgery for clinical reasons. And while we're there, we stimulate those structures in the brainstem, called the reticular activating system, where Daniela began her scientific career. And we can generate intense feelings. I mean, really intense feelings within seconds. The patient, for example, there was a patient reported by Blomstedt. Within 5 seconds, she went into a suicidal depression. She just wanted to die. She had no psychiatric history, but stimulating her substantia nigra, a particular part of the brainstem, like that, sent her into a. And when the stimulation stopped, within 30 seconds, she felt better again. So you could reliably produce intense depressive affects. So that shows that you're generating feelings in the brainstem. And this patient, having a cortex, could say what it felt like. But that's only 2 methods. There's also a third method, which is that you can use positron emission tomography, which is a brain scanning method. And you can look at what's going on in the brain when a person has intense feelings. So you can image fear. Person's in a state of fear, you take a scan. You can image rage. Person's in a state of rage, take a scan. Joy, the person is happy and thrilled to bits, you take a scan. Sadness, you take a scan. What all of those scans reveal is that the activation in the brain that correlates with that feeling is not in the cortex. It's in the subcortex, and mainly in the brain stem. So, as these different lines of evidence accumulate, so it starts to become more and more secure that where feelings come from is the brain stem. Very interestingly, a fourth method is pharmacological probes. If you manipulate the chemistries that are sourced in the brain stem, chemicals like dopamine and serotonin and noradrenaline, it's no accident that these molecules are the mainstay of psychiatric medications. Psychiatric treatment of emotional disorders acts on serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, and so on. And these these neurotransmitters, the source nuclei for them is the reticular activating system. So all of these different lines of evidence, all of them show that where feelings come from is in the brain stem. And now I must tell you, to end this point, what is at my point 4, that if you damage the reticular activating system, just a small area of damage, one part of the reticular activating system called the parabrachial complex, an area of damage 2 cubic millimeters big is all that's needed to wipe out all consciousness. So by contrast, you have children with no cortex at all. All of the cortex is gone, and they are conscious and they show feelings. By contrast, you damage just a tiny area the size of a match head in the reticular activating system of the brainstem. All consciousness is lost. So what that shows is, the main point I'm making is that consciousness is, in its most basic form, is feeling, and that feeling is the most basic form of consciousness which activates the cortex. The cortex cannot have any consciousness unless it's activated by the brainstem, by this reticular activating system. And so feelings, it's not just, now we're not speaking linguistically, we're not saying feelings have to be felt. What we're observing scientifically is that the source of all consciousness is feeling. That feeling, affect, is the fundamental form of consciousness, which is a necessary prerequisite for all other types of consciousness. All of our cognitive consciousness, we only become aware of what's going on in our cognitions if we feel our way into it. So it's a matter of, I feel, that's the fundamental form of consciousness. And then it's, I feel like this about that. And we extend our feelings into our representation of the world. And in this way, we come to subjectively palpate the world. Now, point 5, why do we do this? What is the feeling for? I've already told you that it's how we become aware of how we're doing with our drives. The way that we understand drive in neuroscience today is through a mechanism called homeostasis. And so I want to spend a minute, this is my 5th point, telling you something about homeostasis. We living things have to stay within certain viable parameters. There's a certain amount of oxygen, certain amount of water, a certain blood pressure range, certain sugar range, certain temperature range, and so on, that we have to remain within. And deviations from that viable range, what we call the set point, deviations from that are dangerous to our survival. So we have to perform work to get back to that viable range. This is the basic mechanism. This homeostatic mechanism is the basic mechanism behind feelings. As I explained to you earlier, drive demand is felt as unpleasure, and the satisfaction of the drive is felt as pleasure. And homeostasis is the way in which that works. It's important that we understand that Freud didn't know about homeostasis. Freud thought that unpleasure and pleasure were on a continuum, that you're avoiding unpleasure, heading toward pleasure. It's not a continuum, it's an oscillator. That deviation away from the set point is unpleasure, moving back towards the set point is pleasure, but when you're at the set point itself, you feel nothing. So feelings they tell you whether you're going in the wrong direction or in the right direction. That's how feeling of homeostasis works. And these brainstem structures that I was talking about earlier, they are homeostats. They function in this way, homeostatically. So they're regulating how you're doing in terms of your basic needs. And they're in this way making you aware of how you're doing. I'll tell you in a moment, which is my 6th point, why it matters so much that we're aware of it. But I want to just dwell for a moment, because we're psychoanalysts, on this point that Freud didn't understand homeostasis because it hadn't been discovered yet. Freud, as you know, came to this idea in 1920 that in fact the pleasure principle is not the deepest regulatory principle in the mind, that in fact there's something beyond the pleasure principle, and he spoke of this as the nirvana principle. He said that there are 2 principles in the mind. The one is pursuit of pleasure, and the other, separately and deeper, is a pursuit of quiescence, of nothingness. And he said that behind the pleasure principle is the life drives, the libidinal drives, and behind the nirvana principle is a death drive. Now, I hope you can see from what I've told you about homeostasis that in fact the pleasure principle is in the service of the nirvana principle. Getting to quiescence, to nothingness, not having any feeling at all, is the nirvana state. Moving away from that state is unpleasure. Moving back towards that state is pleasure, which just says you're heading towards where you want to be, but the deepest place where you want to be is no need at all. And that is the nirvana state, the set point. So very important are 2 things. The one is that it's not 2 principles, it's the same principle. The pleasure principle is in the service of the nirvana principle. And secondly, that the nirvana state is far from a deathly state. It is the ideal state of living creatures. It is the goal of the pleasure principle to get to nirvana, because that means that your underlying needs have been met. Now, there's much that I could discuss about the clinical implications of that for psychoanalysis. I will just say briefly, there are, of course, many clinical phenomena which are deathly, but they are not the product of a death drive. The drive to nirvana is the most profound life drive. And those clinical phenomena are aberrations. That's why they're clinical phenomena. They are things that have gone wrong. And I'll leave that to the discussion because I see, as usual, I'm talking too much. So what is it? Why, this is my next point now, point 6. Why do we feel these deviations? Because there are many homeostatic mechanisms which don't entail feeling. Like, for example, I mentioned blood pressure earlier. You don't feel the regulation of your blood pressure. The reason why you don't feel the regulation of your blood pressure is because it's an automatic process. The reason why it's an automatic process is because it's a very simple mechanism, whereby you've got to increase or decrease the dilation of the vessel, and you've got to increase or decrease the heart rate. That's it. And it's always the same thing, what you've got to do in order to make your blood pressure go higher or make your blood pressure go lower. It's very simple. So there's no choices need. There's no decisions that have to be made. But that does not apply let me go back to the example of respiration. When I said earlier, you're normally not aware of your respiratory control because it's automatic, it's easy. But if you're suddenly in an emergency situation, now you're in a room full of carbon dioxide because the building's on fire, you've never been in that situation before. Now you need to know how you're doing so that it can regulate your voluntary behavior. If I move this way, there's less oxygen. If I move that way, there's more oxygen. How do you know that? Because it feels better or it feels worse. So knowing how you're doing subjectively, being aware of the state of your drives enables you to make choices in unpredicted situations, in novel situations, in situations for which a reflex is not enough. An automatic, reflexive, instinctual, stereotyped response is inadequate in unpredicted and novel situations. Feeling enables you to make choices on the hoof, here and now. This is going better, this is going worse, even though you've never been in that situation before. This is the function of feeling. The function of feeling is it enables us to make choices and thereby to survive in unpredicted situations. This is what drive is for. Remember, I told you that we have needs, which are regulated autonomically. Drive generates feeling so that the organism can make choices based on what's good or what's bad for it. The goodness and the badness in terms of survival terms is felt as good or bad feelings. Choices have to be grounded in a value system. There has to be something that's better and something that's worse. In terms of biology, what's better is what enhances your chances of surviving. What's worse is what doesn't. That means what satisfies your drives versus what doesn't. And that means what feels good versus what feels bad. And you'll see again, this is basic Freud, taking us right back to the most basic things that upon which psychoanalytic theory was based. It turns out that this is crucial for solving the hard problem, because that is, remember, the whole hard problem had to do with why do we need to have consciousness at all? The mechanism can work perfectly well without consciousness. Well, that applies to perception and cognition, but it does not apply to feelings, to affects. Affects have to be conscious. The whole purpose is for you to feel how you're doing so that you can, knowing your own subjective state, you can make these choices, which are such an enormous adaptive advantage over mechanisms which are purely automatic. The automatic mechanism only works in a situation where it's entirely predictable what the consequences of the action will be. So voluntary action is what becomes possible through the feeling of the state of your drives. And this is the basic function of consciousness. Now, I must tell you, which is my 7th point, that there are not only bodily needs, of course, there are also emotional needs. And I think it's of enormous importance for psychoanalysts to understand that today in neurobiology, we don't think that there are two drives. two emotional drives. We think that there are many. There are many bodily drives. I've already mentioned many of those during my talk, but there also are many emotional drives. The first one that deviates from the Freudian taxonomy was discovered already in the 1960s and 50s by people like Harlow and Bowlby, the psychoanalyst. Fairbairn also was making this point, that there's an attachment drive, which is independent of our nutritional needs and independent of our sexual needs. And so I mention that just to make you familiar that this is something which even within psychoanalysis we started to grapple with around Fairbairn and Bowlby's work. But in neurobiology, that line of discovery has continued, so that now we believe that there are 7 emotional drives. Lust is the one that we're all familiar with, but there's also something called seeking, which Freud combined lust and seeking into one libidinal drive. He didn't realize they're two separate things. There's also a rage drive. Freud recognized something of that, but there's a fear drive, but nothing to do with libido. Fear is something all of its own, and there's a nurture and care drive. And there's the attachment one that I've spoken about, of us needing to be looked after. And there's even a drive to play. Us human beings, like all mammals, have to play. We emotionally need to play. There's a whole chapter in my book where I summarize what we know about these 7 emotional drives. I just want to say, for our purposes in this meeting, that if there's one thing that I beg my psychoanalytic colleagues to learn about neuroscience today, is that they must please acquaint themselves with what these 7 emotional drives are, because they are the basic motivating forces of the human mind, the basic motivating forces of our patients. And if you think that there are 2 as opposed to 7, and all the neuroscientific evidence is that there are 7, then acquainting yourself with what these basic emotional drives are has massive implications for your clinical work. So that is the one bit of modern neuroscience that I think really every psychoanalyst should at least acquaint themselves with, that so that they can decide whether it helps them or doesn't help them if they look at their patients in relation to these 7 needs. Now I'm coming to my next point. I think it's point 8. Yes, it is. Which is this. It's a very, very basic theoretical point. I've spoken so far about drives and cognition. Now I want to talk about how we conceptualize this in theoretical neuroscience today. We speak of the drive, the demand made upon the brain to perform work, and then the work that's performed, the cognitive part of it. We use the word prediction. We say that we have drives, which is the need, pressing on the mind to do something about it. And then we have to have a prediction of what must I do? How do I meet this need? That concept of prediction is fundamental to modern theoretical neuroscience. We say we are born with innate predictions. Those are reflexes, as I told you earlier, reflexes and instincts, stereotyped response patterns. And we also have instinctual response patterns, innate predictions to our drives, our emotional drives. So, for example, fear, I told you, it's the homeostatic set point for fear is I am not in danger. That's where I need to be. If I am in danger, I feel fear. Then I have to do something. That's the work. The work is freeze or flee. That's the instinctual behavior that we're born with in relation to fear. And if you do that successfully, then you feel the pleasure of returning to safety until you're back, and this whole need is now off the radar. But freezing and fleeing is not enough of a prediction. It's too stereotyped. It's too. If you have a patient where every time they feel fear, they freeze or they run away, that would be an anxiety disorder. So we have to learn from experience what else to do. And this is the crucial task of mental development, is learning from, I've just used fear as an example. The same applies to all 7 emotional drives. We have to learn from experience. How do I meet this need? And so that process of prediction, memory is about the past, but it's for the future. Learning is for predicting. On the basis of what happened in the past, when I find myself in this state, what must I do? So that the next time I'm there, I will know in advance what to do. So the feeling of our way through the problems, through voluntary actions, as I told you, it's not just here and now feeling, that's what consciousness adds, but it's also learning from the experience. So in the next time you're in that situation, you don't have to feel your way through the problem again. You've learned from the past a prediction of what you must do in that situation. So that distinction between drives and predictions is basically coincides with what in psychoanalysis in our classical theory we call id and ego. The id is the drives. The ego is the learning from experience of how to meet those drives. Now I must come to my 9th point, because I'm using up lots of time. These predictions, if they work well, then we automatize them. So, because once you've learned, you feel your way through a problem, and you have to be conscious of, I feel like this about that, so that you can feel your way through the solving of the problem. The feeling has to be attached to cognition while you feel your way through the problem. But once you've solved the problem, once you've got a prediction that works successfully, you don't need to be conscious anymore. You now go back to that process that I said we start with, where it's just automatized. But these are not innate automatisms, these are learned automatisms. So we speak of declarative memory systems, that's pre-conscious in Freudian terms, and non-declarative memory systems, which is unconscious in Freudian terms. And we slowly automatize our predictions down into these non-declarative systems. Why are they non-declarative? It's because the problem's solved. You don't need to feel your way through this. And so you have quick, automatic, reliable solutions to life's problems. That's what we do. We automatize them, and it goes down from cortex, which is where the declarative memories are, into these subcortical structures like basal ganglia and the amygdala and so on, where these automatic predictions are executed. Now, here is another part that's very important for psychoanalysis. So we've learned in neuroscience how memories become unconscious, how predictions become unconscious, that they're no longer thought processes, now they're just automatic response patterns, which can only be enacted. They can't be remembered, they can't be thought. So how do we link what we do in psychoanalysis with what I've just told you? And this has led us in neuropsychoanalysis to the idea that what we call repression is where you automatize a prediction even though it doesn't work. It's the best solution the child can come up with. The child is overwhelmed by its needs and it cannot think its way, feel its way through the problem. And so it automatizes a solution, even though it isn't really a solution. We call that a prematurely automatized or an illegitimately automatized prediction. And this is how we find ourselves back in the situation that I described at the beginning of my summary, when I said our patients feel something, but they don't know where it comes from. Just as I said in that experiment about the faces, that the subject prefers face B, but they don't know why. They don't know where they learnt. It's unconscious. The prediction is unconscious. So that basic mechanism, we in neuropsychoanalysis think that this is crucial for understanding psychopathology, that our patients are executing, enacting, repeating childish solutions as to how to meet their emotional needs. In other words, how to satisfy their emotional drives. And the application of this to our clinical work has all sorts of implications, which I will leave to our discussion. I just want to make the point, our patients suffer from feelings. They don't know where their feelings come from. The repetition, the enactment in the transference is the prediction. It's the predictions can only, or unconscious predictions can only be repeated. They can't be thought. And the interpretation of transference involves the making of the patient aware of what they're doing in relation to how they meet their emotional needs, which explains why they suffer the feelings that they do. And we, in the last few years in neuropsychoanalysis, have been doing a lot of clinical research around the application of these ideas to our field. I'm coming to my 9th and then my 10th point, and then I'm done. I really am going to go fast now. My 9th point is just this. The predictions that we've come up with, in other words, our ego, what we've learned through our lifetime, our individualized way of meeting our emotional needs in the environment that we find ourselves in. In theoretical neuroscience, we call this the predictive model. The predictive model is the fabric of everything we've learned, remembering that the whole purpose of learning is learning how to meet our needs in the world. So they are predictions. That's why we call them predictions. And I've told you that what we're trying to do is solve the problems so we can automatize the predictions. So there's a great pressure to render unconscious our predictions. We don't want problems, we want solutions. And I've told you that some of them are automatized prematurely, and that this is critical for understanding psychopathology. Now, I just want to make this basic point, that we speak about the efficiency of the predictive model. In theoretical neuroscience, the whole question of to what extent are these predictions succeeding in actually meeting the need of the organism, that's the efficiency of the predictive model. To the extent that that what you do does not actually meet your needs, then you have what's called prediction error. And that's the same thing as homeostatic deviation. In other words, there's a demand that the need has not been met. So prediction error and the efficiency of the predictive model, in other words, how little error is there, is a measure of how well the ego is functioning. Now, why I'm saying measure is because all of what I've just said in a few sentences, there is very complicated mathematical modeling, which enables us to quantify this whole process. And this leads to this concept of free energy, which I'll just mention now, and we'll see if anybody wants to go into it during the discussion. Free energy is basically the energy that is not being used effectively. In other words, the efficient predictions that succeed in meeting the drive demand, that energy is bound. And the energy that is left over, which is a function of the errors, of the inefficiency of the predictive model, we call free energy, which I hope you can see ends up being the same thing as drive. So here you see in a very elegant, mathematically elegant way, we can quantify drive via this concept of free energy, and it links to predictive processes, which we understand extremely thoroughly, mathematically, computationally. We've got very sophisticated models of how this all works. So we are able to model now computationally the absolute essence of the driving forces of id demand and ego work that learns how to satisfy those demands, which is where Freud started in 1895. He said, one day we'll be able to quantify these things. There is an energy here, but we don't know how to measure it, and so on. Through the free energy principle, which is really the cutting edge of theoretical neuroscience today, we're beginning to achieve Freud's greatest dream, that we can have a natural science of the mind, where we can quantify psychical energies. That the idea of a psychical energy has become an embarrassment to most psychoanalysts. But any natural scientist will tell you that you can't perform any kind of work without there being an energy. So, you know, there has to be a mental energy. If we're going to incorporate the mind into science, then we have to, and so through the free energy principle, we've been able to do that. And this has brought people like Carl Friston, who are you know, really at the cutting edge, as I say, of theoretical neuroscience today, a deep appreciation of Freudian ideas. These are ideas which have now they've now found their moment, and I think it's a very exciting time for psychoanalysis. And at the same time, what we're talking about is solving the problem of why we have consciousness at all. And so Freud's wish that we can have a natural science of the mind coincides also with the wish that we can find some place within the fabric of natural science, within the neurosciences and as I said, information science, statistical physics, and so on. A place for consciousness, a place for feeling. This is a golden age that we're entering, in my opinion. My 10th and last point is that because even though I'm trying to translate all of this for you in a conversational way, I know it's difficult. So I wanted to end by telling you that there are 3 papers that you can read, which I've written specifically for psychoanalysts. The one is called The Hard Problem. They're all with my name, Solms, Mark Solms. The first is called The Hard Problem and the Free Energy Principle. If you just Google that, Solms, Hard Problem, Free Energy Principle, it's in a journal called Frontiers in Psychology, Frontiers of Psychology, and they've got a special section for neuropsychoanalysis. And so this is written for psychoanalysts. The language that I use is about metapsychology. So that's the first paper. That was in 2019. In 2020, I wrote a paper called New Project for a Scientific Psychology, which is an updating of Freud's project, New Project for a Scientific Psychology. That's in our journal Neuropsychoanalysis. The first paper is freely available on the internet. The second one, I'm not going to tell you how to get it freely available, because you've got to subscribe to Neuropsychoanalysis, because that's your duty if you want to bring psychoanalysis into the 21st century. But there's a study group that's starting soon who's studying that paper. So if you email me, I'll tell you how to join that study group. And I'll tell you my email address is the last thing I'll tell you. The third paper that I recommend you read is called Revision of Drive Theory. Again, it's my name, Mark Solms, Revision of Drive Theory. I'm publishing that in JAPA, Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, in October this year. But if you email me, I'll send you a preprint of the article. So that's further reading to cement better what I've tried to say in this forum today. My email address is mark.solms. You can see my name on the screen here, mark.solms @neuro, as in brain, neuro PSA. It stands for neuropsychoanalysis, neuro PSA, one word, neuro Peter Stephen Anthony .org. That's my email address, mark.solms @neuropsa.org. Email me there and I'll tell you how to join that study group looking at the project. Email me there, I'll send you a preprint of my paper in JAPA, Revision of Drive Theory, based on everything I've just said to you now. And the first paper, you just Google it and you find it. There, Olga has put my address in the chat line. That's the end of what I wanted to say. Sorry, I told you I always speak too much, but what can you do? These are complicated things. There's at least 45 minutes left for discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Wonderful, as always. I hope enlightening for most of our audience. probably hard for some people. So then I'm just going to very briefly summarize some of Mark's points, just to start the discussion, really, just not to say the same thing. But it's just that if people are not familiar with your work, I think that this can be a bit of a shock, the things you said. So I'm going to try to summarize some of those ideas, hoping it helps some of you. So then the starting point for me was the hard problem of consciousness, which is, it can be divided into many points, but I'm just going to highlight a few of those. So the first one is like, why are we conscious? And then if we're going to ask that question, it means, what is consciousness? What is my real question? What is the bottom of that question? And then the bottom would be a very philosophical edge that we're touching here, which is, why are we alive? Because then the answer for consciousness is to survive. It's just to enhance our chances of survival. And then I think the core of the talk is just to say and to really just highlight that consciousness is fundamentally affective. And then if it is effective, we need to know again what affect really means. So it means experiencing life. It means knowing that you're alive because you can feel. And then it comes to the question about cognition and about where it is located in the brain, which is probably also very hard for some of you. But the main theory still says, I think, Mark, that your book is so important because of that. That it is in the cortex, so it's a corticocentral view. And then what Mark is saying is like, no, we have to give up on that view because we have all the evidence that we need to look in the brainstem. So then he talked about some of those regions and very important complexes like the parabrachial, and we're talking about very complicated minimal nuclei. So then I'm not going to go into that, but then I would like to highlight as well the cognitive aspect, which is so privileged in psychoanalytic techniques, which is just like, if you speak about your affects, then you know what you feel. That's basically the belief. And what Mark just told us, from my view, is like, no, you need to feel, and then you need to figure out what you're feeling about something the way you're feeling. That will be like the main thing about clinical work. So then you know that you're feeling something, you need to know what you're feeling about something. And then I think from there are many points about the free energy principle, which is how we are a predictive organism. You talked about very sensitive points, and I was just talking to a group about this, like the dead drive, and how we don't have 2 drives, but that we should think of at least 7. And well, there's also more in the primary processes, but then I think that will raise some points in the discussion. And about your papers, I don't know if they are really easy to read for psychoanalysts. I may challenge your point of view there. I think it's really easy for you probably, but maybe not for some of the people. So yes, some of them are saying like, no, it's not. Okay, so then, yeah, we need probably more introductory courses and lessons just for some of you to be able to read this wonderful work that Mark has been writing. I was a reviewer of that paper, The Hard Problem of Consciousness and the Free Energy Principle, and I know it very well. I don't think it's that easy, but, but well. So just to sum up, then consciousness is fundamentally effective. Then consciousness is there to solve problems, to solve needs, to enhance our chances of survival. We cannot, at least at this point, talk about a dead drive. We need to re-examine those concepts and why Freud was so convinced about that. And the last thing, this has many implications for clinical work. So then I will stop there because I really want to hear what people have been thinking and asking themselves. And I know that we have many questions in the chat. I don't know if we can allow people to unmute themselves to ask the questions, or if I should read them.
Well, you'd have to select the questions.
Yes.
So
Probably, yeah.
It's probably, since you're doing the selecting, you might as well do the reading.
Okay, very good.
Because if you just unmute us, then there'll be 20 questions at the same time, where somebody has to prioritize the questions.
Okay,
So
then I
while
will.
you're choosing the question, you, Daniela, or you, Olga, I'm not sure who's choosing the questions, but I want to just say that was a fabulous summary. I don't know why you can do it in 3 minutes and I needed an hour. But of the 3 papers that I recommended, the one on drive theory that hasn't been published yet, I think that's the simplest of the 3. So do please email me. I mean, obviously, I want nothing more than to be understood. I don't want to muddy waters if I don't have to.
I think
Sure.
you can make the selection, Danny.
Okay,
Right?
very good. So we have very interesting questions. So then we have one from Alexei. He's asking, is there consciousness in the state of contentment when all organisms' needs are met and the organism is in the nirvana state? There are no feelings to speak of. What do you think, Mark?
Well, it depends what's meant by contentment. I just need to say that there are many, many different bodily needs that we feel just as much as we feel our emotional needs. So I'm just focusing on the emotional ones. So when we say there's 7 drives, there's 7 emotional drives. The curious thing about the emotional drives with respect to this contentment and nirvana, all of them are homeostatic. But one of them, the seeking drive, works in a paradoxical way, which is that if all of your other immediate needs, bodily and emotional needs, are met, then you click over into seeking, which is the default drive. And what seeking does is it proactively engages with uncertainty. So this is the best way to link it to our own experience. Is it's why are we interested in novelty? We're interested in the unknown. We're interested in things that we haven't already solved. And that's the seeking drive. So it's all, the world is endlessly unpredictable. So the purpose of the seeking drive is in advance, once you're in the luxury of not having any other immediate pressing demand, in advance you engage with what's uncertain so that in future it's not going to bite you in the backside. You've already come to understand something. So we experience that as curiosity, interest, engagement in the world. If you call that contentment, then yes, we get there quite regularly, where you're not having a pressing demand, and then the feeling is just one of, I'm interested and engaged in the world. But it's not a state of quiescence in the sense of no need, because our predictive model never becomes perfect. There's always error in our predictive models. So there's always uncertainty. We're always having to learn something new. And to that extent, there's always some sort of drive, some sort of demand. I hope that's an adequate answer. If I may just add a clinical footnote to that, this seeking mechanism, the opposite of it is depression. So the shutting down of seeking, no curiosity, no interest, no optimism, no expectation, no engagement with the world. And that's a very horrible feeling. So it's homeostat, has an unpleasure and a pleasure, just like every drive does.
Thank you, Mark. We have a question from Hessel Boebum, who says, question on the drive play. As I read The Playful Brain from Pellis and Pellis, it seems to me that play is the drive to experiment with dangerous or risky situations in a safe situation, where you can step out of the dangerous situation. The situation is as if, which seems to fit Winnicott's idea of therapy as a play situation. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, so this is an important point for the psychoanalysts in the audience generally. I know it sounds really odd to hear that there's a drive to play, but I'm glad that he reminded us of Winnicott. So Winnicott had a whole theory about play, and play was fundamentally important in Winnicott's conception of the mind. But it always was some sort of parallel theory. We couldn't link it to Freudian theory and drive theory, for example. The fact that there's a drive to play makes it for an easy integration of Winnicott with classical theory in a way that I certainly never would have expected. And this is one of the things about neuropsychoanalysis generally, which I find very gratifying, is that it's unifying different schools. It creates some sort of overarching scientific framework within which we can incorporate all the things that we've learned, not only Freud's foundations, but all the things we've learned since Freud, incorporated back into one integrated model. So yes, there's a drive to play, and it's a trying out of in the as if, as Boerboom said, that it's as if is what makes it safe. It's not real rage or real fear or real separation distress. So we play at mommy and baby, and we play at cops and robbers, and we play at teacher and pupil and doctor and patient and so on, trying out these different roles. But it's not just the roles, it's the affects that lie behind them. Lust in the case of doctor and patient, because you examine the body, you're allowed to take clothes off. The cops and robbers, it's about fear and rage, and teacher, a pupil, it's the seeking and the dominance and all of that. But all of it is safe because it's not real. And the crossing of the boundary to it becoming actual lust or actual rage or actual fear, then it's no longer play. So learning how to play. Remember, we have the drive to play, and then you have an instinct as to how, instinctual prediction as to how to meet that drive. That's rough and tumble play, but most rough and tumble play ends in tears. So that's because it doesn't work. Everyone can't dominate. You can't. There has to be a mutuality and a reciprocity. So learning how to do that is the mental work of play. And as I told you, this work has to be performed by the ego. It is learning through experience how to meet our needs. And play is terribly important because of the as-if quality. It provides the safety that Hessel's talking about, where we can, because as long as it stays play, we can learn how to meet our needs with not through real trial and error, but through this sort of virtual business of as-if play. It, in that sense, also lays the foundations for thinking. Thinking is also as if, in the sense that you're not really doing it, you're imagining what would happen if I did that. So it opens up that whole vast expanse of what we call symbolization, and what Fonagy and that lot call mentalization and so on.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We have a question from Lisandro Valles in Uruguay, who says, for you, what will be the difference between instinct and drive? They are qualities of neuropsychodynamic phenomena. And he says, I agree that affect is conscious, but its mechanisms are unconscious. It would be a manifestation of the id, but there are areas of the cortex that energize, cathect representations and objects that the working memory of the prefrontal cortex processes. These representations would be conscious.
Yes, so well, there's a lot in that question. First of all, I'm very grateful for the first part of that question, because there's I don't know how it's translated in Spanish, but in English, Freud's terms for drive and instinct are mistranslated. So in German, the terms are Trieb and instinct. Those are two very different words, which mean two very different things. But in the English translation of James Strachey, he translated both of them as instinct, which is very confusing. The drive is the demand for work. In other words, it's the homeostatic deviation. That's I need to be here, but I'm not. That's the measure of how far am I from where I need to be. That's the drive. Mm-hmm. The prediction, what must I do to get back to where I need to be? We're born with predictions. Those are instincts. So I gave you the example of fear earlier. Let me give you the example of rage. The set point for rage is there are no obstacles between me, preventing me from getting to the object of my need. If there's something preventing you, getting in the way between you and the object of your need, that's a deviation from that prediction, from that set point, and it's increasing frustration until eventually you're really, really angry, and then you got a prediction, which is attack. like that. That's the prediction. It's an instinct. It's called affective attack. You can't attack everyone that frustrates you, so you've got to learn from experience what else to do. How else can you get rid of frustrating obstacles in the world that you find yourself in, other than just attacking and kicking and biting until the thing relents? So that is the drive, and the instinct is the prediction as to how to meet that drive. And then instincts need to be supplemented through learning from experience. Now, this leads to the second part of the question, which is, yes, indeed, there are, so the cortex, we have all these predictions. Remember, we've got, I've told you, we've got 7 emotional drives. Then there's the infinite number of different contexts within which you have to learn how to meet those drives. You can't just use one solution. So you have millions and billions of predictions about in this context, what to do, depending on this, contingent on that. So this is why we need all of this very complicated learning from experience. And you can only be consciously solving one problem at a time, because working memory, which you referred to, is such a small thing. It's really ridiculously restricted little capacity. So everything else has to function automatically. Everything else has to function unconsciously. So why we need to become conscious of our cognitions is only when there's prediction error, only when there's uncertainty, only when we don't know what to do. So the mental work of conscious cognition is predictive work. In other words, it's not executing a prediction, it's forming a new prediction. And that is this problem solving. I call it predictive work in progress. And this is cognitive consciousness. Cognitive consciousness is a state of uncertainty, feeling your way through the problem. You have to feel if you are uncertain, because remember, that's the whole point of feeling, is that you don't have a prediction. The feeling tells you this is working, this is not working, this is working, this is not working. And once you've solved the problem to the best of your ability, then it becomes a prediction again. Now it's not a state of consciousness. And so working memory is the drive makes a demand on the mind for work. Working memory is the work so demanded. In other words, the feeling of your way through the problem so that you can lay down a new prediction. Cortical predictions can always be reconsolidated back into consciousness because the problem isn't adequately solved in a generalizable way. And that, by the way, what I'm describing is secondary process. Daniela used the term. Secondary process is that mental work, the slow business of uncertainty and having to inhibit the automatic response. Primary process is the automatic response, the automatized response. There's no thinking, it's just doing. So again, you see how these basic Freudian concepts, how beautifully they map onto how we understand cortical versus subcortical predictive mechanisms. And the subcortical ones are the ones that are automatized. There's no consciousness there. The cortical ones are also not consciously executed, but they can become conscious again when they need to. So that's the difference between declarative memory and non-declarative memory. Certainly, the predictive work in progress, that is cortical. That is a conscious cognition. I'm not saying that all consciousness is affect. I'm saying all consciousness is in the service of drives, which the conscious form of which is affects, which are the demands upon cognition to perform work, and the cognitive consciousness is the work itself. It's not the same thing as the affect, it's the response to the affect. I hope that sort of addresses the main points.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, and we also have the two terms in Spanish. We have pulsión and we have instinto. So that's the same. It's drive and instinct, trip and instinct. Yeah. So then it's the same problem with the translation. So then we're also waiting for your new translations of Freud's work. So then that's coming as well. I don't know when, Mark. You always tell me
it's coming. Yeah, I know it's been delayed a lot for all sorts of reasons. Not all my fault. but it's coming in spring, definitely.
Okay. Okay,
I'm just busy finishing the indexing right now. It's done.
Good. So then save up some money to get them. We have another question from Bruno Ples, who says, what do you think about the dynamic core hypothesis of Edelman and Tononi? How do you think it relates to the psychoanalytic model of consciousness?
Well, I think in a very general way, let me speak about Edelman, because Tononi adds a whole lot of other things. I think that Edelman's pioneering contributions were very much in the direction of where the field has gone. So what Panksepp and Damasio and Merker and I myself and Kristen, since he became interested in these things, I think that what we're doing builds in very much in the direction that Edelman took us, which was to introduce the concept of value and of valence, and to foreground therefore affect. This was really a novelty at the time that Edelman started to point us in that direction. So when you say how does it relate, I think that it's a slightly more sophisticated, a little bit more biologically plausible. I mean, Edelman's theory was very speculative and very general because it was new. Pioneers do that. Where the kind of work that's been done within the active inference framework and the free energy principle and predictive processing generally and so on is a much more sophisticated, much more comprehensive and much more evidence-based and much closer to how the brain actually works in mechanistic detail than Edelman's rough and ready sketches in the first. Tononi, as I said, is a very different story. There's lots about Tononi that worries me.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We have a question here from Jose Munoz in Colombia. He says, if the seeking system and the lost system have not only different circuitry, different top-down modulation, but also different maturation rates, where does that leave infantile sexuality as Freud understood it?
Well, first of all, Freud was always puzzled by how come sexual arousal is pleasurable. His basic idea was that increasing drive tension is unpleasant, decreasing drive tension is pleasant. Well, he didn't see it like that, he saw it like that. But the point is that with increasing sexual arousal, there should be increasing unpleasure. Why do we, in foreplay, says Freud, why do we extend the foreplay, extend the tension, and why don't we just go straight for orgasm? And this really puzzled Freud, right from the 3 essays onwards, he was talking about it. So I want to say that, first of all, in relation to this point, that because Freud didn't recognize their separate drives, so the consumatory pleasure of lust is very different from the appetitive pleasure of seeking. Okay, so for seeking, the anticipation is pleasurable, but it's a very different pleasure from the consummation of sexual desire. And that's just one example. So, those two types of pleasure are two examples of the 7 types of emotional pleasure that we can experience. And from what I'm saying, not only does it help us to explain the simple business of sex, but the much more complex business of our emotional lives generally. So I've given you the example of here, foreplay we can understand just by recognizing that lust and seeking are 2 separate things. Multiply that, and then you will see why this is relevant for all the clinical phenomena that we deal with, understanding the 7 different basic emotional drives, makes you see things much more clearly, much more simply too. Now, the point about infantile sexuality is not best addressed just with reference to lust in relation to seeking. Remember I spoke about attachment, and in affective neuroscience, we call that drive the panic grief drive, which is the need to be cared for, the need to have a caregiver who us mammals and birds, by the way, we have to have an attachment object because we cannot look after ourselves. We're helpless. We mammals need to be suckled. And so that's a separate need from lust. Now for Freud, remember, there's one kind of pleasure. It's libidinal. I've already told you how you have to divide lust and seeking. There's not just one pleasure. The same applies to attachment. It's a different kind of pleasure. Freud said, because the infant suckles, even when it's not hungry, that means it's sexual. And that's what he called oral libido. Or that's an example, a crude core example of oral libido. Oral behaviors which are not nutritive for Freud or sexual. Now, what I've showed you is that, not me, I mean, this was discovered by over decades of, in neuroscience, that there's a drive that is being satisfied there, which is neither nutritional nor sexual, it is attachment. So what Freud calls oral libido, we would in neuropsychoanalysis conceptualize it in terms of the attachment drive, which is a separate need. There's a pleasure, the pleasure of being loved and looked after and warm and fuzzy and there's mommy and all that. And the dependency, the satisfaction of the dependency, all these oral things, they're there, they exist. It's true that they're very important in the development of the infantile mind, but we don't call them, they're not the same as lust. They're not driven by sex hormones, and they're not driven by the peptides that are relevant to lust either. They're driven by, the main mechanism of that drive is mu opioids, and you know, there you also the links with psychiatry of it's not only the different schools of psychoanalysis we can integrate, also psychoanalysis with psychiatry and so on. You know, the patients who are addicted to opiates, they're satisfying that drive through a drug, and there I can mention the death drive. That's deathly. By short-circuiting, that you're supposed to go via reality to meet the need. You actually need a caregiver. To short-circuit it and just shoot up heroin is what I think of as deathly behavior. It's not a drive. It's an aberration of the drive. The pleasure principle should take you through the reality principle in order to get to nirvana. You can't get to nirvana except through doing the work demanded by the drive. So I'm saying many different things at the same time. There's an importance to divide, to recognize for Freud, if it was pleasurable, it was libidinal. That's not true. There are many pleasures. The difference between seeking and lust, I've explained how that's, even the simple matter of foreplay is, Freud could never understand that. The thing about infantile sexuality more generally, I've said, well, these things exist, but they're different forms of pleasure. And why do we call them sexual? Because of the history of our field. I don't think it's helpful to call attachment bonding sexual. I think it's a need all of its own. The same applies to the so-called anal sadism. It exists. The rage drive is there. You know, to get rid of the frustrating obstacle is there. Likewise, in play, what Freud called the phallic libido, the competitive, displays, and mine's bigger than yours, and all of that. This is very important in the mental development of the child, status and rank, and all of that. But it's a different drive. So I would say we rediscover the very same phenomena that Freud called infantile sexual phenomena, in our modern understanding of the emotional drives of the human brain, but we don't think they're all components of lust. We think that they are actually independent needs of their own. Which brings us to, if I can mention one last thing, the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex is the fact that we have to learn how to master all these different drives. So the fear in the Oedipal situation, and the rage in the Oedipal situation, and the competitive rivalry in the Oedipal situation, and the lust, and the attachment, and these all conflicting with each other. You're frustrated by the object that you also are attached to, that you fear the object that you are enraged by. How do you master all of these conflicts? That's what we call the Oedipus complex in psychoanalysis. But I think when I say we're in a golden age or entering a golden age, it's wonderful to be able to say, well, this quaint idea of an Oedipus complex, which people joke about outside of psychoanalysis, we know how important it is inside of psychoanalysis. Now we can say, no, that's just a word. We're talking about this thing, this thing that you guys all see in neuroscience, that, all these drives, and they have to be reconciled with each other. Well, who do you think they're going to be, first of all, directed towards? And they're going to be directed towards the parents and the siblings, because that's the group you find yourself in, and so we kind of demystify and that's a very good thing, very important thing for us to do. The communication goes in both directions between our disciplines. I think I'm saying too much again. More questions?
Yeah.
Wonderful reply to that. You just covered many of the questions that I have here, just about some of the topics, but there are many about aggression, actually. So then it's good you mentioned it. And there is one in particular from Mila Petkova, who says, I was wondering about suicide and suicidal ideas, which are just so much more in common. Is it just a shortcut to the nirvana state, or is there more to it? Are they avoidance of seeking?
Well, let me answer that over two levels. First of all, the direct question that Mila's asking. Suicidality is a good example of deathly behavior, which is not the expression of a natural drive. I mean, of course, suicide is, what could be more deathly than killing yourself? The same applies. I used the example a moment ago of shooting up heroin. In other words, drug addiction. This is also deathly. I could mention many other examples. Anorexia nervosa is deathly. These are behaviors which I first of all want to point out once again are pathological. They are aberrations. They're not the expression of a drive. They are, otherwise, why would we call them clinical conditions if this was the natural state of things? What they, all of them entail is what in classical nomenclature we would say omnipotent fantasies. That as opposed to the reality principle, the way that you really get a caregiver, really a reality principle, a real caregiver, is you got to perform work. It's hard to get mummy to pay attention. Mummy's got a mind of her own. Mummy's got needs of her own. How do I solve this problem that I want her to be with me, not with him and not with the other kids, and so on. This work is how you learn how to satisfy that need. Taking a drug gives you the illusion, the omnipotent fantasy that I can have the warm, fuzzy feeling of being loved without actually performing the work. And the same applies to suicide. You got frustrated. Things are not going the way you want them to. Things are getting in your way. Nothing's working the way that you want it to. It's enraging. So how do you get rid of the frustration? You kill yourself. That's an omnipotent fantasy. You haven't actually gotten rid of the obstacles. You're dead. It's even worse. So and as you know, what lies behind that is the omnipotent fantasy that this will teach them a lesson. Those frustrating, impeding obstacles. But spot the mistake. You're not teaching them a lesson. You're not even there anymore. So it's the same sort of thing. It's a short circuiting of the work that's required, actually getting rid of the frustrations, so that you can actually meet your needs in the world rather than have the illusion of no needs through being dead. And let me not go into anorexia. I'm just saying this is what applies to all of these. These are all omnipotent fantasies rather than really solving the problem in life. So that's what I mean by deathly behaviors. But they, as you can see, they're driven by these other drives, which we short circuit. We try and get to the nirvana without the work. That's not the work of the drive. That's the aberration of the drive. There was something else there. I said I wanted to answer it over two steps, but the second step I've forgotten now. So maybe we should just move on to the next question.
She mentioned something about seeking. I don't know if you were thinking about that or no.
Well, the death drive has no special relationship to seeking or to any of the other drives. The death drive, what Freud calls the death drive, in other words, the nirvana principle, is getting to satiation, getting back to the settling point. That, as I say, requires work. Now, maybe I can say this, although this is not what I had originally intended to say. What lies behind the drives and the instincts, because both of them are inherited. We're born with drives and instincts, is long evolutionary stories. So that, for example, the reason that so much pleasure attaches to orgasm is because that is how the sperm gets to the ova, and how conception happens, which leads to reproduction, which is terribly important in evolutionary biological terms. There's nothing more important in evolution than that you have to reproduce to keep the species going, which is what it's all for. It's survival in order to reproduce is the driving force of evolution. So that's why so much pleasure attaches to orgasm. But now that's the evolutionary story behind it. But we, individual subjects, remember this is about why do we have subjectivity? This is the science of psychology as opposed to evolutionary biology. Why do we indulge in sexual behavior? It's not to perform our biological duty, that we have to keep our species going. That's why the pleasure attaches to it mechanistically. But for us, it's the pleasure. We want the feeling. We just do it because it feels good. And that is why we do a whole lot of different things. We don't only have heterosexual, missionary position, reproductive sex. We do all sorts of things, including homosexual sex, including masturbation, which is never going to lead to reproductive success, including all kinds of weird and wonderful other perverse things that people do. Because it's nice, they like it. So the question, this question of the feeling, as opposed to the mechanism that lies behind the feeling, is a revolutionary idea of Freud's. When he was saying that the pleasure principle, we are motivated by the feeling, and he explained much about sexuality on this basis. I think that it's very important that we remember that the evolutionary mechanisms that gave rise to those feelings and the feelings themselves are two different explanatory, two different sciences, actually, two different, and just as I said about different methods, we need different methods in order to solve scientific problems. We need different disciplines too. In our discipline, we should never lose sight of the subjective and the felt, because that explains a hell of a lot of what we do. And this is why in neuropsychoanalysis, we are not trying to replace psychoanalysis or the psychoanalytic method with neuroscientific ones. We're wanting to supplement it, and we're wanting to bring the psychoanalytic perspective and method into neuroscience so that neuroscientists can learn properly the importance of subjectivity and at the heart of that of feelings. You will never be able to explain why people do what they do if you don't recognize the causal role of feelings in human behavior. I don't know how I got there from that question, but somehow I did.
I don't know either, but it's again just a great response. So then I'm sure Mila is going to be pleased with your answer to her question. And I'm going to just give you a very quick last question. You can answer yes or no because of the time. So Dominic Rumier is asking, is there any love drive?
Any what drive?
Love drive.
Love.
Yes.
Well, so let me answer it this way. In romantic relationships, which is, I presume, what you mean by love, there are many different components. There's lust and there's attachment. Those are the two obvious ones. So if you're saying by love, if you mean attachment, well, that's one kind of love. Then there's lust. That's another kind of love. And you have to bring the two together in a romantic relationship. Some people can't do that because those attachment feelings have to do with our parents, usually our mum. It's quite hard to bring lustful feelings and mummy feelings together. And there are people who whose love lives fall apart because of that. But that's just two. In romantic relationships, there's also rage. You know, your lover can also irritate you. I hope not only my lovers have irritated me, I hope it applies also to the rest of you. You know, so the attachment feeling and the rageful feeling, they conflict with each other and have to somehow be incorporated into some way of loving that can accommodate all of. Then there's seeking. You know, I want to be with her forever and always, but I also want to see what else is available. That's seeking. This is also a very difficult thing in romantic relationships. So when you say, is there a drive for love? I would say there's not one drive for love. Love in the sense of loving relationships, romantic unions, and so on, that last, have to do with finding a way of reconciling all these conflicting drives with each other. I think that there, the Freudian idea of drive fusion is very important. Drive fusion and drive diffusion, Freud's thought of those as progressive and regressive, the progress in mental development and regression in mental development. Freud conceptualized it in his later work in terms of drive fusion and drive diffusion, except he thought there were only two drives. I think the same concept can be applied to the 7 drives. And there I'd like to make the link to the Kleinian conception of the depressive position. I think that the notion of a depressive position, as opposed to the paranoid schizoid, turned into neuropsychoanalytic terms. The paranoid schizoid is not just the split between good and bad. It's there's 7 different types of bad and 7 different types of good. So the depressive position is finding a way of which is love. I would like to link love with the depressive position, like a real relationship that actually works and it incorporates. Yeah, of course, I'm attached, but I'm also lustful, and I'm attached to you, but I'm also interested in what else is going on. You know, and that's also true. It's there. It has to somehow be incorporated. You know, and yes, I love you, but you know, sometimes I hate you. You know, that the ability to build all of that into a relationship is what I would call love, realistic love, as opposed to each one of these different split off types of pleasure. And the concept of drive fusion, I think, is very useful there. And the Oedipus complex is also a way of which you're trying to negotiate all of these different conflicting emotions toward your primary objects. So the importance of navigating successfully the Oedipus complex is the same thing as finding some way of reconciling all these drives with each other, which is the same thing as what the Kleinians call the depressive position, which is a whole new way of understanding what mental health is. That's probably a good final word.
I think it is. Yes, thank you. So then You see, I mean, Mark always says, I don't want to speak for too long, but you can just testify that he loves speaking and we love listening to you. So if you want to listen to more of Mark, Maggie Sellner just shared about our meeting. We're going to have our annual meeting, not a Congress properly, from the society, because we are not in love with the online format for too many hours. But she says everyone is invited to register for our upcoming meeting, June 12th and 13th, where Mark will have a dialogue with Lionel Nakachi, and there will be a breakout session in Spanish. So then you're all welcome, and you can visit the website so you can register for the event. We're finishing the program for that, so we hope you can join us. And then I would just like to end the session by saying, thank you very much, Mark. I think that you've given us all this input, just to understand how important it is that we update Freud's theory and we try to question it in a good way, just to know if our clinical work is going well, if we're doing the right thing. We should have, I think, what you said about having different methods to just study and conduct research and everything about certain topics, such as dreams, of course, consciousness, our topic today. It's fundamental for the work we're doing. So then, thank you very, very much. I think it was a wonderful talk with wonderful questions. I'm sorry about the questions that we couldn't get to. It's just about time, trust me. I mean, I found all your questions very interesting and your comments. So then my email address is also in the chat if you want to write, and then we hope to have the recording available soon. So if you want information about that, I think we'll publish it on the website too, so that you can find it. And I don't know, I just want to thank Olga so much for giving us this opportunity. So Olga, thank you very much.
Sure. Well, before we leave, I do think, Mark, that maybe we can have some second sessions sometime in the future, in the near future, because there is so much to learn. And, we don't really know all of the implications that this will have with theory and technique. And sometimes we have to unlearn what we have learned. So I think, as we start reading and doing more research, some of us are quite new in this. It would be wonderful to have one more session. And yes, this will be recorded and it will be in the Asociación Psicoanalítica Mexicana in the Facebook. Okay, so we are honored to have had you. It is a great privilege. So thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Daniela, for coordinating this wonderful session. And there are so many comments that are thankful for your presence today, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting us. And thank you, Daniela, for being the intermediary like that. And thank you all for attending. I would be very glad to have a further meeting. I enjoyed this
maybe
very
with
much.
some tequilas in presence.
Yes, that would be even better. There's probably 8 drives. There's also a tequila drive.
A tequila drive, that would be wonderful. Great, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll be seeing you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Cheers.
Bon weekend.
You too.